No, it was very interesting because, when I got my first Leica and I got my Ilford film and I went to Defusky Island and I took those pictures, the next thing I did was I got on a Greyhound bus and went to New York and went to the office of Magnum. And I was like 18 years old, and who should I meet there but Cornell Campa was in the office. Mm-hmm. And he looked at my picture. He said, "A very nice young man." He said, I'm going down to the bar to have a drink. Will you join me?" So I'd never been in a bar, and I went to the bar, and so he ordered scotch, and he said, "Well, you have." I said, "I'll have the same." And so I've been a scotch drinker ever since, and then of course I went back to Columbia, South Carolina, and he said, when you later on, he said, when you finish I had to go into the Army and all of that, I was drafted, and there was a draft in those. He said, "Come back and see us," and eventually, years later, that's another story about how I joined Magnum, and I guess I finally got some money together from a wonderful publisher, gave me enough money to allow me to go to Greece to start working. This was now 1962. All right, jump ahead. In the meantime, I had worked as a photographer at a music festival in North Carolina, and I was a bad musician. I was a bad flute player. And my sister went there with her violin as a student. So I got a job there as the camp photographer. And they built a darkroom for me, a wooden darkroom, no air conditioning in the summertime. And it was so hot in there that I would take all my clothes off. I was stark naked photographer in there making prints. And at any rate, and all my interest in classical music and my work, which I'll tell you about, starts. My father's restaurant was down the street from a pawn shop, and one day he was walking by the pawn shop with my little sister, who was about 7 years old, and she saw a violin in the window, and she started crying and wanted it, and he bought her the violin. And of course then she started taking lessons from a music teacher, and then I wanted an instrument too, so I got a clarinet, and that got us plugged into the whole classical world of music, So I became the photographer at this music camp, and then after that music camp, I heard about a place called Tanglewood, and I wrote a letter, "Dear Sirs," to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Boston, Massachusetts. The letter ended up in the hands of the publicity director, the PR director for Tanglewood, who was living in New York in the wintertime. So I got a letter back, and I sent them my clippings from this festival. So I got a letter back saying, "Dear Mr. Manos, we have seen your work. Please come to New York with a ticket for a Greyhound bus. Please come to New York for an interview." I got on the Greyhound bus, went to New York for an interview. Then the PR guy said, "Oh, well, I like your pictures." He said, "You're hired." I was hired to be the official photographer for the Boston Symphony at Tanglewood, and I guess I was about 18 years old. Wow. So I put my darkroom equipment in the trunk of my Ford, drove to Tanglewood, and they built a darkroom for me when I arrived, and I photographed Pierre Monteur, Leonard Bernstein, Rudolf Serkin. I was backstage with him. I was backstage in the room with Isaac Stern, and he had this double violin case sitting there, and I was sitting there waiting, and he said, "Young man," he said, "you know what those violins are?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "They're Stradivarius, both of them." And so I had these wonderful musical experiences, and it was just like heaven. So I did 3 summers at Tanglewood. Then I went back, and later, a few years later, when I got out of the Army, I did a book on the Boston Symphony. I had the run of Symphony Hall, photographed, with telephoto lenses during the concerts, hiding in the organ loft, wearing a Phantom of the Opera black. Everything was black, And then I have a famous picture of Charles Muntz from up above. I was in a trap door directly over the conductor during a concert with the camera clamped to the edge of the trap door, looking straight down, and I had this picture of him with his arms spread, and they were, it was just what a life. I can't believe it. That I was just this kid, but I guess I was lucky. That I had these wonderful experiences.